Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And on this week's episode, we are talking about humor in resistance, unpacking Frederick Douglass' playful parrhesia. To be honest, this is a very new topic to me. I know it's about humor, and I'm excited to learn what it's about. But it's a very unique topic, quite niche. We've talked about humor on this show before, but I think today we're going to have a very different lens with our guest of the day, Chris Kramer. So I would like to welcome Chris to the show and introduce him to everyone. Chris Kramer is an assistant professor and chair of philosophy at Santa Barbara City College. His interests intersect across the philosophy of humor, mind, religion, informal logic, existentialism, and phenomenology, and oppression. He wrote his dissertation on subversive humor, half about humor, half about oppression. Readers will laugh and cry, but mostly because they are reading a dissertation. What has become of their lives? So thank you so much for joining us. That's a wonderful bio, Chris, and thanks for joining the show.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate this. Should be fun.
Yes, it will be because especially we're talking about humor, right? I'm curious because, as I said at the very beginning, this is a very niche topic. It's not the humor that we've talked about before on the show, and I know that you wrote a whole dissertation on it. So I'm very curious to learn what led you there. You know, what was that moment that was like, okay, I have to write this dissertation.
Well, I don't know that it was a moment. I had been interested in humor, laughter, I guess, since I was probably 4 or 5. I made my first joke, and my family, the way that they reacted to it, the way that they laughed, and the way that made me feel, I'm reading back. It's just, at 4 or 5, I don't know what's going on really. But ever since then, I said this joke, and I love the way that it felt. I think I had been trying to find humor wherever I could. And it wasn't until graduate school that I really thought of putting the ideas of humor and looking at it through a philosophical lens. Because the original joke wasn't any good, but coming from a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, it was impressive, apparently.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember what you said?
Yes, of course. It was an amazing joke for a 5-year-old. Again, we were eating scrambled eggs, and my fork was just on the side of the plate, and the eggs were on top of the tines of the fork, and I accidentally hit the fork, and it became a catapult, and the eggs flew everywhere. And I said an explosion, but my family heard egg-splosion, and they explained to me why they laughed at it, and I just really enjoyed that feeling, kind of a warm, glowy feeling of making people laugh.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until graduate school, so many, many years later, that I was reading about Frederick Douglass, and there was a philosopher, a couple of them, who made the argument that Frederick Douglass is basically what's known as an existentialist before there was existentialism. And in some of the autobiographies we're reading, Douglass himself points out how he was prone to see, as he put it, the funny side of things, the fact that he seeks out humor given his situation, which I should tell you, I guess I haven't mentioned that yet. Frederick Douglass in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, or prior to that, was a slave. And then later freed, he escaped and became a free man and an abolitionist, and went on public speaking tours. He was an amazing speaker. And used humor to a considerable extent. in his speeches as a mode of, combating what is overt, explicit oppression. And so my interest in humor, which was already there, and my interest in the Civil War, around the time I was 5th or 6th grade, excuse me, I was interested in the Civil War because my dad had a bunch of Civil War books, I suppose, and I became a what they call a Civil War buff, the American Civil War. And I'd read about Frederick Douglass, but I didn't understand any of it. I had seen images, and I perhaps read stuff. I can't remember if it was speeches or his autobiographies. And I remember the feeling of being confused, but also angry. And it wasn't until, again, graduate school where I saw perhaps connections between the role of humor and the role of resistance in the form of resistance, excuse me.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's very unique as a point of view, and I love that you told this story about your childhood memories and also the books that your dad had lying around. You were kind of connecting the dots later on in life, and you're right. It's not one moment, but it's a collection of different moments that sort of shaped why you chose to do the work that you do, and that's always interesting, right? Each person's story. And today we're going to discover more and more about that story, I think, in a little bit. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we would love to get to know you a bit more through things that you love. And this is a segment we called Have You Met Chris? I'm going to have 5 questions for you about things that you love, and we would love to know more about them. And the first thing is, what's your favorite book?
Oh, strangely, wasn't prepared for that specific question. Wow. I don't know.
Probably hard to pick one favorite because I see so many books behind you.
Yeah, no, that's all a facade. They're all empty and filled with liquor bottles. No. Well, I really like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It had its 50th year anniversary, I guess, last year, which is also my anniversary as a person. I was born 50 years ago. And I reread it recently. I hadn't read it since, 2000, before I was a father and a teacher. And there was a lot in the book. It's Robert Pirsig, very interesting book, connecting Zen, philosophy, and there's quite a bit on motorcycle maintenance, which I know nothing about. I know a little bit more now, having reread that, but the way he interweaves it, the way he talks about an excursion throughout the Northwest with his son on motorcycles, his son named Chris, as it turns out, which is my name, and his connections with education also. I'm going to go with that as my answer. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I might change it as my favorite at the end of our conversation, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very hard to pick one favorite book. Well, especially if you're an avid reader, right? So that's totally fair. And, maybe you'll share a few more books as we go along. So the second one I would love to ask you is, which is a movie that you've enjoyed recently?
We've been watching a lot more of series, and I guess we've been with the family. My kids are 11 and 13, so most of the Marvel films we've gone through. I'm not going to assess them. They're fun, let's say.
Yeah.
But I did get to rewatch The Good Place. Are you familiar with that show?
Is it a TV show?
It's
a
TV show.
Yeah. I love that show.
And my kids loved it too, which was great because it has, one of the main characters is a philosophy professor, and they don't make him look ridiculous as many shows tend to do. So I can't really talk philosophy with my kids. They immediately feel like it sounds like a lecture, and they shut me off. So this was an indirect way of bringing philosophy to them, as was another show, AP Bio. I don't know if you know that one.
Oh, that's a new one for me. What's that about?
A Harvard professor loses his job. He teaches philosophy. He's a bit arrogant, so they make fun of this guy. But he has to teach an AP Bio high school course. And the whole point of it is him trying to get back at his nemesis. It's actually not a good message, ultimately, but it ends up it's funny. It ends up being okay. It's fun to watch
Yeah.
for the kids.
Yeah. That sounds interesting. Another one about philosophy. I'm kind of sensing a theme, you know?
Well, then there's The Simpsons, which my kids have found.
Yeah.
It's weird it's taken this long. In fact, I watched about 5 episodes today, as it turns out, with my son. He's sick. He had to stay home while he was sick today. But we watched a lot of Simpsons, so.
Well, I actually haven't watched The Simpsons yet, so there's that.
Well, there are 32 years of it that you can go through.
Yeah. I mean, it's always fun to leave something that, you know, everyone has watched and then just, you know, explore it. Like I've heard a lot of people tell me, oh, I have never read or seen Harry Potter. And I was like, okay, you're going to have a treat. So, you know, that's kind of like my treat that I'm saving. I think I saw it on Disney and I was like, I was very tempted to click on it. So yeah, now that we're talking about The Simpsons, I might just actually start watching it. Next one, I would love to know. You're a podcast guest, but I wonder if you actually listen to any podcasts in your spare time.
I do. I ride my bike to work, so I do have some time to do that. In Santa Barbara, it's usually pretty good weather all the time. Lately, I've been listening to something called Philosophize This is the name of it. It's a philosophy podcast. The Partially Examined Life, which is another philosophy podcast. As I say all this, I realize perhaps I should expand a bit, but philosophy is pretty interdisciplinary as it is. There is an interesting one called Pitchfork Economics, which is about economics, and econ talk. So those are two things I've been listening to recently that aren't explicitly philosophy. And this podcast, I do listen to. I've actually heard you many times, in fact.
Oh, that's so great. Thank you. That's a new one.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, thank you for supporting us.
Of course.
I mean, most of the guests would say, you know, like they would give us a shout out because they're on the show, obviously, but not every one of the guests has like try to listen to the podcast before the show because most of our guests are very busy professionals, right? So, and some of them don't even listen to podcasts. If anyone's like, I have listened to you on the podcast before, I'm like, thank you.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah. So that is about podcast. Very great recommendations and quite on theme with your professional work. Now, I wonder if you have, I know today we're talking about Frederick Douglass, but I wonder if you have a specific role model in life or maybe multiple role models in life. I wonder if Frederick Douglass is actually one of them.
Well, that's a good question. I, as far as a role model for being courageous and honest, to anticipate a discussion of parrhesia, then yes, I think I don't have a single role model. I don't know that I thought much about this question until it was asked. To be honest, I think perhaps there's role models for different aspects of, me, as far as being a person. My parents, I'm going to just go with that. I think that's fair, unmistakable. That may not be true for everyone, but it's true for me. My wife's pretty good too, as far as a role model for being a person, I think, in many ways. Regarding philosophy, I think my first graduate school philosophy professor, I'll give a shout out to Robert Francis Gotti. And as far as profession of teaching, Michelle Rodert, I think, would be, Rock Valley College, would be a good role model with respect to teaching. But again, I think there's a lot to gain from reading Frederick Douglass and seeing him as a model for how to present yourself, how to stand up for yourself, but also other people. He wasn't just speaking, as one phrase is, speaking truth to power, which is perhaps a cliche it's become now, but parrhesia is that basic concept is freely speaking your mind, even when, perhaps even especially when, there are potential risks to speaking out. And given the situation that Douglass is in, which is nothing remotely like anything I have ever experienced or probably ever will, nevertheless, the way that he presents himself, the way that he conducts himself, the way that he stands up for himself, but also with a playfulness, which is, I think, the general topic here,
Mm.
is unique and modelable, if that's the right word there.
Yeah, interesting word choice.
It's
I think
it's not
it's
a word, is what you're
yeah.
saying.
Well, I think I don't know. English is not my native language, so who knows? Maybe it's a word. But I will say, yeah, we can coin it today. And I will say that I love that you choose, different aspects of your life with, and there are different role models for all of those aspects. And, this is actually a new theme that we found on our show with our guests is that, you don't necessarily need or you don't have to have a role model. Most of the time, people have several role models, and some people also say, "I don't have any role models. I learn from everyone," and that's the beauty of life, and that's exactly what you just showed us. So thank you for sharing that. Final question in this part, we would love to ask you. I know that you're actually a professor, you're teaching, but I wonder if you still remember things that you've learned, courses that you've taken, or maybe you've taken a new course recently. And if so, what is the most impactful one to you?
So the one that was most impactful was 30 years ago, probably around now,
Mm,
30 years ago. It was a
yeah.
philosophy of religion class. Dr. Sherry Katz was the professor,
Mm,
and I was a history major, and it was this class that got me to also major in philosophy. And so I would credit that particular class. I remember it a lot.
mm,
The way that she conducted the class, the way that she got us engaged in role playing, which I thought was terrible at the time. And I was like, why are we doing this? And then we did it. It's like, oh, that was interesting. And 30 years later,
mm.
that's what I remember, and not much else from other classes. So that's 30 years
Yeah.
ago. And then the more recent one, I guess, I don't remember when it was, 2011-ish. It was a class in political philosophy. I guess I touched on it briefly before. Um, another mentor, perhaps in a way, at least as a chair of my dissertation, Michael Monahan. It was his political
Mm,
philosophy class where we were reading Frederick Douglass, and I was already, had some background in Douglass because of my history buffness, if I may, and so kind of interested in that historical era, but unaware of the role that Douglass himself played in philosophy and how philosophers have looked at him, historians, literary critics, rhetoricians, communications theorists, and so forth have written a lot about Douglass. But it turns out there's some philosophers who have as well. And so he made it into the political philosophy class, and his conception of humor and his use of humor, I thought, even in the worst possible scenarios, was first of all fascinating, and surprising. And then we start to realize, wow, this is a kind of theme. There are other people who have used humor in the most unlikely scenarios, going up through the Holocaust with Viktor Frankl and his work, which is relevant to this podcast, I suspect, Man's Search for Meaning. And in there,
yeah.
he talks about the role of humor against the
Hmm.
absurdities of the Nazi Holocaust. So there's some interesting parallels there. But
Mm.
those two classes, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. They're quite far apart, and probably in different stages of your career, and they are still impactful to this day. So I think that's a really great thing to learn. And most important thing is we can always learn more as we go along, and that's the beauty of learning, and that's what the show is about. So let's get into today's topic and talk about humor in resistance. Again, as I said, it's such a new topic on the show. So I'm excited to discover what it is that you would like to share with us today. But to set the scene, the show is about happiness and the science of happiness. So I would love to know from your personal perspective, how do you define happiness?
So even though I totally knew this question was coming, I don't define happiness. Uh, I am not. I don't know if I'm not prepared to define it. It's too difficult, or if there aren't, in the philosophical sense, to my mind, what we oftentimes call necessary and sufficient conditions. Like, here is the definition of happiness. Um, So instead of a formal definition, I have a quote that I read once from a tea bag, and it was anonymous. Okay, and it is childhood would be an ideal state if only it happened later in life. And I haven't looked into this to see whether or not, I'm sure there's a person that somebody knows who said that. There's a sense of me that wants to keep it anonymous. I'm not entirely sure why I want that. Maybe it feels like it's partly mine. But I think there's, short of defining what happiness is, we could look at children, young children, and see how they are, how they behave, how they carry themselves. Not again, but assuming they have the basics met. Simply being childlike or being a child is not sufficient to being happy. That's certainly not the case. But we have a neighbor we just saw yesterday. I think he's 6 years old, and he was dressed as a teenage mutant ninja turtle. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that America has, I think, spread to the world. So
yeah.
you're welcome.
Lots of things.
Yeah.
Lots of things in America spread to the world. Yeah, that's
I
one
know.
of them.
I know. Well, maybe we'll talk about some of the humor with what might be spread later. Anyway, I don't want to get into the politics of that particular current situation now.
Yeah.
But this is not the first time we've seen this 6-year-old dressed to go to school. This is what he wears. I don't know what school he goes to, but it seems like an awesome school. But this takes, either supreme self-confidence to dress as Spider-Man or, just a regular day, or a lack of social concern, a kind of unself-consciousness, which might be an element of happiness, a kind of playful attitude that's certainly going to be relevant with discussion of humor. But, this kind of playfulness that doesn't have the naivete of a 6-year-old, that's kind of what seems an ingredient to the potential for a happy life. I started going through a bunch of notes seeking a definition of it, and I decided, well, this is a whole paper. Maybe I can't possibly do this here. But to tie it in with laughter and humor, I think there are some connections there. I think playfulness, or rather the lack of playfulness, is a potential sign that something is off. Oddly, I just read in, I think it's Jonathan Haidt's work on the problems of social media in childhood and the lack of playfulness. There was a statistic about, and you'd have to confirm this is accurate. I'm quoting from Jonathan Haidt from memory here, about serial killers, that just as every serial killer that we know of, sorry, this went weirdly from children playing to serial killers.
That's okay. I'm sure you're getting somewhere.
Well, let's see. It was incongruous. That not only do all serial killers, is it found that they have harmed animals in their youth, but it seems to be the case that for all of them, they lacked playfulness. They lacked the opportunities for play. And so this isn't to say that if a child is not able to play or not playful or not engaged in it, they're going to become serial killers, of course. But I find that it seems there's a pretty clear connection that playfulness can perhaps play a role in a happy life.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is actually a really unique one. First, we've had on the show. If you've listened to our show before, you probably have heard a few guests defining happiness, and some have their personal definition. Some come from an academic background, and they sort of put all of the things that they've researched and learned into definition. I think in this case, you're telling us an interesting story there with perspective on happiness that I really love, because I do agree. Sometimes when I think about happiness, I do tell myself and ask myself, actually, why was it that I was so happy when I was younger, when I was a child, and now I find it so hard to just find happiness or be happy.
I was not super carefree as a child, but I remember that I was very happy. That's what I remember. And interestingly enough, you're talking about serial killers and criminals, and I've been watching Criminal Minds, and that's actually like quite true, because they do tell stories about, you know, like how serial killers become serial killers. Obviously, some are sociopaths, some are psychopaths, but most of them have something happen in their childhood. And I think what I learned from what you just said, and that reminds me, is that, you know, our childhood shapes who we are, you know, as well as our the way we see happiness, I'd say. And sometimes, especially for me personally, if I struggle to find happiness, I would think, okay, what did I do in my childhood that I was so happy? Okay, I had a routine. I was playing. I was very playful and just playing games with my neighbors, and I wasn't relying on technology. And that's kind of like the little things, right? That they sort of line up, and they bring me back memories and things that I could do to be a bit happier that day. You know, whenever I need a little boost. So, you know, like that's what I took from your definition.
A little boost. Yeah. Well, is it called Sero Boost, right? So,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
the serotonin, right? I,
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why it just now occurred to me. I should have looked this up, but I believe serotonin is released when we laugh. I think. I hope that's
I,
true. Damn it! I should have checked
yeah.
that out first.
I think it's released on some different occasions. You know, when
Okay.
we laugh is one of those, and then on some other occasions as well. If I'm
Dopamine
not wrong,
might be
also
another.
like, yeah, and when we exercise, we also release dopamine and serotonin. If I'm not wrong, somebody has talked about this on the podcast before, but you know, my memory is not that great, so we might have to fact check that and
Yeah.
you know, just look it up.
Could
But
I
this
ask?
is a great starting point.
Could I ask a real quick question? You
Yeah.
said when you played games, what kind of games were they? Do you remember?
Uh, Yeah. So I love this game. It's a Vietnamese game. I'm Vietnamese. I was born in Vietnam, and we have this game that, interestingly enough, you just pick random rocks to play with. In Vietnamese, it's called Oan Quan, and the concept is basically you've got, I think, like rows, 2 rows, and then, you know, like two, and then yeah, two like different areas at the beginning of the either ends of the 2 rows of rocks, and then you pick them up and then you distribute them. And then when you distribute them in a certain way, like you have to put one in each square, and then if you distribute it in a way where when you finish distributing the rocks, there's an empty square, you can get all of the rocks in the next square, and whoever gathers the most rock wins. And I don't remember the exact rules, but I remember playing this game with the neighbor children, you know, neighborhood friends, and it was just so fun. I don't even remember who they are at this point. You know, I just remember playing that on the street, and you know, drawing all these squares, and you know, distributing these rocks that we find randomly. It's not even sanitary now that I think about it, but it was so fun.
Well, that's the reason I asked that, is because I think there's a distinction between playing games, and that particular game seems like it's on the border between
It's like a
games,
board game.
but it sounded like you have some leeway in how it's played. There's randomness. The rules
Yeah.
aren't necessarily, or maybe they are. Maybe there's more to it that I'm unaware of. But you think of playing games like sports. Kids play games, of course. Sports is great, but
Yeah.
there's rules to it. There's less creative, imaginative play. There's less free-flowing, in the moment flow experience that maybe some psychologists discuss that with respect to happiness on this podcast in the past. That flow
Yeah.
experience of being in the moment, not concerned with performance, you know, not worried about, am I going to lose? Am I going to win? Am I going to fail? Am I going to make mistakes? The kind of playful attitude that is intrinsically valuable. It's valuable in and of itself. In certain kinds of games, that's what I think is most of interest. It's valuable in and of itself, not as a means to get something else. It's something that it's enjoyable, and therefore it's an end in itself. You do it just for the sake of playing, whether or not
Yeah.
you win or lose. And so that kind of playfulness, it's there's a philosopher of play and games who's I've recently found in the past couple of years, named C.T. Nguyen, and he makes this argument, I think, quite convincingly, that play of this sort, this openness. I think he doesn't talk specifically about happiness, but he's talking about how we can use a playful attitude to help avoid the kind of cognitive biases, you'll call them epistemic traps, or belief traps, and playfulness is a means of doing that. And maybe that'll come up a bit more in our discussion, because I think Frederick Douglass utilizes that kind of intellectual play in his speeches and in his autobiographies and in his interactions with other people to great benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds interesting. We're going to get there very soon. I have one more question that's like a tradition on this show we have to ask our guest. I know that you don't necessarily have a definition of happiness, and you sort of told us a few things that you think would bring happiness. But when you observe people, or, in your work, when you do the research that you do, is there anything that you notice that people tend to get wrong when it comes to happiness? Misconceptions, as we call them.
Well, I don't have, I think, much novel here. Plato beat me to this one 2,300 years ago, as did Aristotle, where we're and the Buddhist tradition as well, where we confuse happiness with success, and typically success is deemed to be, at least in the United States, I'm not sure if we've exported this notion to you all as well, but success is almost always termed in monetarily. It's how much wealth have you accumulated? And I think students, oftentimes I see, do have that mindset that it is getting to the point where because they say this, so I have evidence of it. They say it, that it is indeed, I'm in this class so that I can get a degree, so that I can get a job, so that I can have money. And then we go into it further because, they're aware, many of them are, that the amount of money you have beyond the bare minimum to make sure that you have the necessities, the more you accumulate beyond that doesn't increase your happiness. I think a lot of students are aware of that. But I think still they are less inclined, many of students, I don't want to say all, but more so than the past few years, many years rather, they're more open to finding shortcuts to achieving things. And they'd be even willing to receive a degree, a diploma, without having gone to classes. There's a thought experiment that I employ in class that kind of gets at this. It's called the experience machine. A guy named Robert Nozick invokes it from the 70s for a different reason. But basically, idea is, would you agree to be hooked up to an experience machine that gives you whatever experience you want, right, for a certain amount of time? And the assumption of the thought experiment was that nobody would want to do this because it's taking away the actual activity, the actual doing, the actual performance. In the context of class, it's taking away, the actual drudgery of doing the work, and then seeing your diploma on the wall, realizing you've done that work. It means something. But I have noticed, and there's kind of happiness that comes with that, but I have noticed a large proportion, too large to my mind, of students admitting in public that they would be fine with having a degree that they received without actually having gone to all the classes. It changes when we get into more details, but as far as, kind of meandering answer to where people might be mistaken, I think that's a mistake. I'd have to give an argument as to why, but I think that would be one.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an interesting one. The notion that a success and lots of money would bring happiness, being a misconception. We've sort of touched on that before, but I think that experience piece is also an interesting one and a new one. Especially when it comes to life and happiness in life. I think it kind of is probably similar to when we talk about the opposite of happiness. Again, like the hard emotions, they bring about happiness, and same as experience. The hardship of, for example, going to class and doing all the assignments, the thesis, the research to get a degree. That sounds arduous, but I think it brings happiness to a certain extent. That you have to experience all of this in the big picture to know what happiness means. And not having that experience, obviously you won't get a very deep understanding of what it means. And I think, at least for me, it's like that. I actually appreciate all the hardships that I've went through when I, for example, got my master's degree. It's like, oh, that was so hard. Would I do it again? I don't know, but I will say that it helped me a lot in becoming who I am, and appreciating happiness in life more. So totally agree with you there. We could talk about this all day, by the way, but I know that we have a bigger topic to explore today. So actually, let's get into that. Let's talk about humor, parrhesia, and happiness in context, right? And as I said, this is a new thing for our audience. Humor is something that we've talked about before. Parrhesia is a new thing. So, how would you define these two concepts? Especially in relation with each other.
Okay. Parrhesia is actually a simpler concept, I think, to define. And I borrow it from Michel Foucault and others, going back to ancient Greek thought. It's the root for it is saying everything, speaking everything. But that's not typically how someone like Michel Foucault uses it. It is the way that he refers to it is, sorry for the cliche, I despise them, but here it is, speaking truth to power. That's what it is. It is courageous truth-telling, I guess you could say. It is being frank is a word that comes up a lot, which is perhaps genuine is another term. It is authentic, but it's also serious. And so that's going to be perhaps at odds with the concept of playful humor, because parrhesia is serious. It's about serious matters. It's about justice and injustice. It's coming from, and here's the connection to subversive humor, it's coming from those with less power, and they're speaking to or about and attempting to change a system that is, at least with the case of Douglass, oppressive. And so there's a kind of interaction between those without power but who have the truth with those who have power but presumably lack the truth. And sometimes it's referred to as a kind of parrhesiastic contract, which is an interesting word, or a game, right? And I think Foucault uses both of those. I may be confusing that. There's a contemporary scholar in communication studies who really makes an excellent connection between parrhesia and Richard Pryor through critical race theory, critical race philosophy, critical race studies. And J.P. Rossing is his name. He talks about the humor contract with respect to Richard Pryor's comedy from the 1970s. And so that's the key, is that it's truth-telling, but in the face of or to those with power. And so there is risk. Those elements are essential to parrhesia. It is speaking truth with the potential for damage to you, either to the extent potentially death, significant harm, ostracization, a number of other kind of potential consequences of saying what is true or what you believe to be true. I think we should clarify. Although most of what we know from Douglass's critiques, he was on the right, and the slave-owning Southerners who he was fighting against were wrong. With respect to defining humor, like happiness, I don't want to do that. Sorry. I think it's not because there hasn't been efforts in the history of philosophy in defining humor, nor happiness for that matter. I mean, there are people who do give Aristotle gives a definition of this. We see existentialists apply concepts that can give us a sense of what humor is, even in the face of tragic existence, for example. But I'm inclined toward what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein refers to as the family resemblance approach. Instead of saying, here are the criteria for humor, here are the necessary and sufficient conditions, such that if you're missing one of them, it's no longer humor, or if you have too many, it's too broad of a definition. You look for family resemblances, like my son resembles me. He doesn't have all of my same features, because then he would be identical. My daughter resembles me and my wife and so forth, and you can pick and choose and see where there's overlap. I think that might be more fruitful. However, related to the discussion here, I think it's useful to look at some theories that have been very effective at explaining a lot of humor. So I don't think any theory succeeds in explaining every instance of humor, from slapstick to puns to much of what, humorous narration, mimicry, kinds of things that, as it turns out, we'll see, Douglass engaged in. But there's something called the incongruity theory, where humor results from the playful, non-threatening recognition of an incongruity, where something doesn't fit. Your expectations have been suddenly, and that sudden part's important, suddenly shattered. You have an expectation of how the world is. And then when that confronts you immediately and quickly and suddenly, there's a kind of recognition that what you believe to be the case, or a kind of belief that you thought was true, becomes dissonant, unconnected with the way the world actually is in front of you. And there's a couple of things that can lead you to either hide that incongruity, especially if you're now recognizing, I had a belief about the world is not fitting that, it's inconsistent, it's incongruous, it's dissonant, whatever. I might want to squash that and be uncomfortable, because I'm uncomfortable with that feeling of dissonance. And so we rationalize and pretend it didn't happen, or that it's not really that way. And that happens, I think, with those who are less inclined to a playful attitude. And so incongruity theory connected with what might be called play theory, a kind of playful attitude, positions us to be open to shifting perspectives. It positions us to be open to surprise, open to the unexpected, open to doubt and confusion and ambiguity, which is more of what you find in reality than a kind of logic of purity, of absolutes. As much as we might like that, because it's comfortable to have absolutes, the world doesn't really offer that in reality, as it turns out. And so being open to recognizing confusion, doubt, and our own mistakes, we're more inclined to do this with a playful attitude. That will help us be open to shifting perspectives, which is another element of playfulness that C.T. Nguyen talks about, and one of the benefits of an attitude of playfulness. And so where does this all come from? Just to wrap this section up, because I guess it could go on for a while. When animals play, if you have pets, if you have two dogs, or if two dogs are getting together, you see that they're fighting. And then from the outside, if they're not our dogs, we'll look at them and we can't tell. Sometimes I cannot tell, are those dogs really angry at each other, or is it play fighting? And of course, the people whose dogs they are, they recognize this is just how they act when they play fight. And those who watch dogs, like the dog whisperer guy, I've forgotten his name. We watched that recently too. That's Cesar Millan. Excellent stuff. He can tell. These are play attitudes. These are non-threatening training grounds for the real world. That's what these dogs are doing when they're very young. That's what kids do when they're playing with each other. They're in a non-threatening sort of sandbox that's preparing them for what turns out to be a horrible world, right? And in this playful attitude that is they're aware that this is not real. This is just play, and there's all sorts of play signals that the dogs present. They can sometimes it goes too far, but this allows for training in the real world, and that's from the evolutionary physiological element of it. But I think you could make a similar case with respect to intellectual play, where we recognize incongruity in language and symbols and representations, errors in our belief systems. And humor can act as a really interesting, very quick, oftentimes, sometimes below the level of conscious awareness, a kind of debugging mechanism. And it's a playful, non-threatening way, because it's not real. It's in the joke world, as you might put it. Where we're playing with thought, we're playing with ideas, we're playing with our belief systems. And when we're in this playful attitude, we're able to shift among different perspectives in a way that we might not if we are in a different attitude, a different frame, like the serious mode of, I got to fix this problem, I got to achieve this goal, and competence matters. If I fail, I'm going to be frustrated, or things are going to be terrible. So there, I think you find an intermeshing of playfulness and incongruity theory that's in the background of a lot of Frederick Douglass's work too.
Yeah, that's quite refreshing, especially you mentioned playfulness, and then being playful, or the play itself in context. And I think about humor, and that makes a lot of sense, because humor is playing with words, playing with the situation, playing with what you have at hand, and like turn that into humor. Like the joke that you made when you were 5 years old, excellent, or something like that.
Explosion, because the eggs.
Explosion, yes, explosion. It's
Right.
like wordplay and playing with words, and like there might be heaps of other examples that I cannot think of right now. That's what happens when you need to come up with an example. You go blank. But I think it's quite new for us to learn from this perspective, especially parrhesia, with the lens that you were talking about, in how you observe Frederick Douglass. So I'm curious to know a bit more about that, especially because the topic we were supposed to talk about as well. Part of it is humor in resistance, right? That's part of the topic. So how does that show in Frederick Douglass' work, or how he carry himself, and what can we learn from that?
So in his toward the ends of, he has 3 autobiographies, by the way, which is interesting. The first one is he adds in the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, written by himself, which is an interesting thing to see because it sounds redundant. It's an autobiography and it's written by myself. There's a reason for that, because a lot of people at the time did not believe someone like Frederick Douglass, who is different only from others by virtue of his skin color, as far as, differences of treatment. And he makes a point of this. The experiences that he had while in the North at night. He wished it could always be night, because people were so kind to him because they didn't know his skin color. And, they were so, he was so amazed at how kind everyone was. And then daylight comes and then the N-word comes out, and he's a whole different person. And so the way he describes this is with a bit of amusement. He talks about how he's able to bear through some of the worst situations with a sense of humor, or seeing the funny side of things. And I think in that context, he's using funny in 2 senses. One, funny, ha-ha, like it gives you that mirth, but also funny, in the sense of strange. And so back to some of the things we were talking about before, it's unexpected. It's absurd that other humans would treat a set of other humans who clearly are similar to them in every morally relevant respect, less than animals. This is absurd. Argument seems to be an odd tool to respond to that absurdity. Douglass does. Abolitionists do try to present arguments and say we should abolish slavery. It's It's abhorrent. It goes against God. Of course, at the same time, there were those who advocated for slavery using the same Bible that Douglass used to argue against it. So it gets complex there. But Douglass has to show his humanity, and his use of humor is one way of doing that, because he's using his cognitive abilities, he's using his emotional abilities, which is humor interweaves both of these. And of course, he's writing these amazing autobiographies, which people doubted were actually written by him. And so he has to actually, in the title, have that as stated. And the way that he calls out these absurdities isn't just through argument, because argument is insufficient. He, in the 5th of July speech, is sometimes called what to the slave is the 4th of July. I mean, imagine this. It's 1852. Slavery is still the law in the United States. He had escaped slavery at this point. I believe he was a free man, but he's giving a speech, and he's talking about, your independence. Think of the irony of celebrating independence, freedom of this amazing nation. And he's kind of baffled why he was invited to speak at this particular case. This is in Rochester. But he talks about it being your holiday. And he's using irony. It's more irony. He uses the word scorching irony. A time like this, argument, justification, logic isn't what's needed. In fact, you already know that slaves are human beings. You already know that they should be treated equally. You've declared it. And here he's referencing the Declaration of Independence. What is needed is scorching irony, because it would be absurd. I would look foolish if I were to give you an argument, right? Here's the syllogism. Here are these premises, and I conclude that I'm a human being. It would be absurd to do that. And yet, we find there were clear examples where the slave-owning South, for example, knew full well, as Douglass points out, they knew at some level that what they were doing is abhorrent, right? They had to lie to themselves. They had to consistently buy into the stereotypes that they had to construct to justify a system of oppression that is slavery. They called it in the South our peculiar institution, which tells you already there's a sense of which they understand it. And I don't, I was looking for the specific quote, but Douglass uses this example to point out there what existentialist philosophers later will call bad faith or self-deception. And so these slave owners are in bad faith, in self-deception. They're lying to themselves to justify, to be able to live with themselves in maintaining slavery. And he says something like Douglass does, look, I'll give you an argument that slaves are actually human beings. When you recognize the absurdity of your laws, you have, I totally messed this up. It's funnier the way Douglass says it, assure you of this, because there were laws on the books that precluded proscribed people from teaching slaves how to read. And he says something like, you know what, put a law in the book that says you can't teach cows how to read. When you make that law, then we can talk about what you really believe. So clearly they believe, the slave owners do, that slaves are human beings capable of learning, capable of reading. And indeed, Douglass does learn to read, ultimately by himself through the Bible, looking at protest papers and actually convincing young white kids to help teach him as well. It's a fascinating story. So he learns how to read, and that changes his life considerably.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think what you just told us there left us with, I think, at least a few thoughts. This one, from my perspective, it's great to hear Frederick Douglass' story. I'm not super familiar with him at this point, so this is like new learning for me at least, and probably for some in our audience too. And the other thing is, the situation that he was in was horrendous, but somehow he turned that into something bearable through, of course, parrhesia and his humor. Through looking at things a bit differently. Right, because in that kind of situation, I cannot imagine myself being in that situation, and let alone to be able to rise above it and sort of make fun of the situation a bit to cope with it. And I think this is probably the best form of humor for us, because I think we probably come across things that we can laugh at or laugh about every day. But when it comes to a hard time or a situation that is challenging, it is rare that we can find a way to make it humorous, or find a way to laugh about it, right? And this is what people also talk about. Like I have this saying that's sort of stuck in my head. When somebody's like, okay, you're going through a tough time, you can laugh about it in 5 years' time, right? Think about it like that. When you look back on this situation in 5 years, what would you laugh about? Right. And I think it's kind of like probably that sort of related to what you just talked about, obviously not in the same scale, but with the same lens that, we can use that parrhesia, that humor, to look at difficult situations and turn it into something bearable that we can sort of go through. And I think this is probably what humor in resistance is about in today's context. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I like that a lot. Because it's extremely difficult to laugh. Like earlier today, my son was not doing well, and I was struggling. How can I make this better? And I was already, anxious, in a bad mood. And when you're in a bad mood and you're aware of it, it's not a simple matter of, I don't know if you know this phrase, turn that frown upside down.
Upside down.
Well, yeah. Don't ever tell anyone that. It's a terrible thing to say. But the way that you described it, it's engaging in a kind of disengagement. Weird sentence there. And it. First of all, I wouldn't suggest as a prescription, like for those who are depressed, clinically depressed, or oppressed, and say, hey, just laugh at it, or it'll all be better in the end. That I wouldn't say that. And most of what I'm thinking about is looking at examples of people who used humor and how it helped them in the past, and kind of giving a descriptive lens of how that worked, how it happened, how it could potentially be used in the future. But I really like this notion of looking at the situation you're in now and detaching from it temporarily. And that's what playful attitude enables us to do, to detach momentarily, not completely. If you detach completely, and then you become kind of what Aristotle calls the buffoon, or you become, frivolous. I should tell you, you mentioned book. There's a book called A Suspension of Seriousness, which is, it is a contemporary work by a guy named Carlos Alberto Sanchez, and he's translating the work of Jorge Portilla. And so that's one that came to mind. It's very good, very interesting, difficult, but I would include that as one of my favorite books now. So a shout out to him and plug. But Portilla would call that seeking the humorous at every turn as a complete or suspension of seriousness, which is a potential problem. But if you can step away from it, detach from it, and say in a kind of thought experiment, how might I look at the situation I'm in even 10 minutes from now? That enables you to have escaped it. And humor, a humorous, playful attitude, if you're inclined to that, it's not something you can necessarily jump into like just, immediately. But if you're already kind of habituating yourself to be in a playful attitude, you're more inclined toward that kind of temporary suspension of seriousness. I mean, you hit your head and it's not funny, but a few minutes later, you can laugh and say, I can't believe I hit my head on that thing that's way on the, how did you even get your head under there? There's a reason I mention this, because it happened recently.
Okay, it actually happened.
But that's what comedy is, according to, I think, Mark Twain. It's tragedy plus time, which is the cliche to kind of get at what we've been talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also the attitude that matters, right? Because sometimes it's like I remember this vividly. Like, it's people in the situation, same situation. I remember going to this bakery with my friend and her partner, and then we were waiting for him to pick up cakes that he ordered in advance. And like he brought it out, and then we were like, okay, let's try it. He opened the box, and it's something savory. It's like not cake at all. So we burst out laughing, me and his girlfriend. We burst out laughing. And he had this serious look on his face. And I was like, oh no. So, that's kind of like in that moment, we were laughing at the situation, but this person who was the one experiencing it wasn't able to detach from it yet, and he probably felt like we were laughing at him, not the situation, right? So it's kind of like, oh, okay, like humor, laughter. There's also, I think there's a little bit of a caveat to it, and you kind of have to pay attention, especially when it comes to being with other people. Like laughing at yourself is a skill, but also knowing when to laugh at a situation when you're with other people is also another skill when it comes to humor. Kind of related to what you were saying, like if you hit your head on the rock, and you actually did, right?
Well,
as you said.
It was something that seemed that nobody should have hit their head on. I don't know how it happened.
And yeah, so it happened to you, and you probably felt pain in that moment, and probably like a bunch of other emotions, and you probably was not able to laugh at it. And if anyone were to laugh at you at that moment, how would you feel, right? But now you can talk about it because it happened in the past. You've got past it. Now you can laugh about it. So it's very different.
And that's explicitly what Douglass says in, I forget which autobiography, about this conception of, he doesn't call it self-deprecating laughter. That has some complexities to it, but the capacity to laugh at oneself opens up avenues. It shows the philosopher of humor, John Morell, will talk about in terms of health, psychological health, the capacity to laugh and laugh at oneself is, at least from his perspective, a necessary ingredient. There's some limitations to that, because if we take it too far, like, do you know, actually, Nanette, the show Nanette by Hannah Gadsby? I think maybe she's New Zealand, maybe she's from New Zealand or Australia. I cannot recall which. But she actually, in a stand-up performance, I believe it was called Nanette, presents the case for her no longer doing comedy about her own trials and tribulations, her own treatment as a lesbian, which was horrible treatment, because she realized that the humor directed at herself became self-harming as opposed to self-deprecating. And so where that line is that I think Douglass found, and I think even the irony in the presentation, the stand-up performance, it still was funny, even though she was saying, I'm no longer to be funny about these things. She still was. That's debated, of course, but she said she's not able to present her stories in full and be funny. And so she had to pick one or the other. And so there's a limitation, perhaps, of subversive humor, especially if it's self-directed in that context.
I see. Yeah. I think, the humor seems like such a simple topic, right? But it's not. Like when you dive deeper into it, there's so much to explore. And, there's stand-up comedians who make a living out of it nowadays as well. So, there's so much that we can discuss, and I feel like, we could probably go on for hours. But in today's episode, with the limited time that we have, I think we've covered quite a bit of, things that related to your work, things that are, through the lens of research and actual stories of Frederick Douglass's life. I would love for us to now ground ourselves a bit and go into this practices and habits section, where we can give our audience something practical that they can take away from today's episode. We've actually talked about this already, how we can utilize and use humor in certain situations, and parrhesia as well. And I would love to close this section with a practice or a habit that you would recommend, or maybe you actually employ this yourself, so that we can cultivate a sense of humor in our everyday lives, and help us live a little bit happier, have a little bit of an easier day, or perhaps someone who's new to this and they just don't know how to employ it. What should we do?
Well, I'm trying to figure out the shortest way to go about this. There's a couple of things. During finals weeks here, there's oftentimes they bring in therapy dogs, which is something that you just put yourself in the place of the dog, and it's calming already, and it reduces anxiety. It turns out, laughter reduces anxiety in many ways. And in fact, it is a kind of calming and also an opening. You, especially if you're laughing at humor and you kind of habituate yourself to be laughing at humor, there are some interesting connections. Avner Ziv, Z-I-V, I think is his name, had some early studies in the 80s about the role of humor in the classroom and the role of humor in facilitating creativity and better preparing students to do well on exams because they're more open, they're more calm, and they're more creative. And interesting studies about how they figure this out. I can't go into the details of that. But one of the things I tried to do is for exams, for example, I would put on before exam, which are always anxiety inducing for everyone, a joke at the beginning. And so that students laugh a bit. And then I started to change things a bit and I put on there a joke, but I left out, this is a logic class, so I left out the premises, or the setup. So there's a connection between logic and humor, or joking and humor here. And then I tasked the students to come up with either their own setup to the punchline, or it's the other way around, their own punchline to a given setup. And some students thought this was amazing because it's fun. There's no right answers, and I got to read hilarious things sometimes not very funny at all. But this is a simple task that engages people. There are downsides to it, too, because they're already anxious about the test. Now they're additionally worried about, hey, I got to be funny now. So I have to be careful.
Yeah.
I have to be careful with that one.
Yeah.
But one of the things I do, one of the things also, as far as my discipline, which is philosophy, that I think is practical, is to borrow from our, I guess, biological tendencies to be addicted to humor and laughter. And the areas of our brain that light up when we're laughing, typically from humorous laughter, are the reward centers, which turns out are the same areas that light up when we get a drug fix or have an orgasm, as it turns out. So, and we're addicted to all of those things, usually with negative consequences, which is not the case, I think, with laughter. And so if you could kind of facilitate in a community, which you can make a classroom a community, you could make, I guess they're laugh yoga. Have you heard of laugh yoga?
No,
yeah,
that's a new thing.
Or laugh clubs. I think they started in India many, many years ago.
Oh yeah, I know about that. Is it the one where they just come together and they laugh?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an easy one. It's just physical. I mean, it's embarrassing, but that's the whole point of it. You just look at somebody's face and right next to you and say, ho, 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 he, ha, ha, ha. You do that for a couple of times. And that fake laughter initially, that kind of manipulated, constrained or contrived situation becomes genuine laughter. Mm-hmm. And so in philosophy, I think there's a connection. And here I try to make the connection for them to see, students, because most people don't know what philosophy is. We don't have philosophy in high school here for some reason, which is a travesty. So they don't know what it is, but they know what humor is. They know what laughter is. They know what comedy is. And if you can make the practical connections, and there are a lot of them, between a philosophical attitude and a humorous attitude, you've already got something that they're practically engaged with because they want to be. They're addicted to it. It's intrinsically valuable to them to laugh at humor. There's a way of getting the attitude that's found there because a humorous attitude, one who is open, they're open to questioning presuppositions, unargued for positions. Somebody in an ideal philosophical attitude hopefully is also doing that. With a playful, humorous attitude, you're open to rational skepticism. You avoid dogmatism, which is also the case with an ideal philosophical viewpoint. A humorous attitude leads to what psychologists call divergent thinking, as opposed to, here's a question. Now, what is the answer that you sort of converge on? Philosophical questions and humor as such are divergent. They don't have a singular response. That's what makes hey, here's the setup. Now fill in the punchline. You're not going to get the same punchline. And I think here's the last point. There's others, but here's the last one I'll focus on that connects with parrhesia and a number of other disciplines. A humorous attitude and a philosophical attitude both foster the appropriate, the ideal, maybe emotional and cognitive distance from the topic of discussion. So you already talked about this a little bit with imagine yourself a couple of years from now looking back at this situation. Humor kind of enables us to step out of our given situation in a way that we can think about it and laugh about it. Because if I'm too close to it emotionally, I'm not going to laugh about it. And as it turns out, as we know from studies in argumentation theory and in psychology, if I'm too close to it emotionally, I'm not going to be able to critically evaluate it. So there's a connection between the capacity to critically evaluate something and find it humorous. And humor kind of puts us in that emotional sweet spot. If I'm too distant from it, I have no motivation, that's the emotional, no motivation to even think about it because it's not relevant, then I'm not going to think about it. And so I can't be too aloof, it won't matter. And a humorous and a philosophical attitude combined in those ways. And I think those provide us with a number of practical benefits, not just in philosophy, but perhaps in life generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great perspective to think about. Try to apply that in our daily lives as well, whenever we can. I think it's kind of hard to tell people, okay, be funny, or like try to find humor in your life. Like it's not that easy. So I think it's just about being, first of all, being conscious of that. The fact that we can, and that it would help. So we can start paying attention a bit more to situations in everyday lives. And I think each person would probably approach this in a very different way. So thank you for sharing that. Now, before we close the episode today, I would love to invite you to your open mic. As I said at the very beginning, this is your opportunity to share about anything else that you would like to share with our audience, anything that you might be passionate about or things that you're working on. So yeah, take it away, Chris.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you again for inviting me. This was very exciting and unexpected. I didn't know I would have anything to say about happiness, which hopefully your audience will not be unhappy with what they hear here. So I guess I should plug something. There is a textbook, which there's some irony here. I don't use textbooks in my class, but I have one to plug. It's called Religion Today, a critical thinking approach to religious studies. It's a second edition. The first edition was written by Ross Aden, a former colleague of mine. And the second edition, also mostly written by Ross Aden, but I participated in it. So I can say without arrogance, I guess, that it's really good and that people should buy it because it's basically Ross's book. It's in religious studies in particular, but I have some sections on critical thinking and issues of justice. So that's one thing. There should also be a book coming out on teaching philosophy through memes, which I think we've already missed the boat on this because I just learned from my son the word meme isn't even used anymore. I'm already too. They've already changed into something else. If I call it a meme, anyway, this book is going to come out too late, but it's on memes, and I have a chapter in that related to the suspension of seriousness and the use of memes, borrowing from Carlos Alberto Sanchez's work on Jorge Portilla, who is a Mexican philosopher, Jorge Portilla from the 1950s. And then I guess the last thing would be I'm hoping to finish a paper and submit it by tomorrow. So this is going to be tight on playfulness. It's going to be tentatively called something like Pedagogy of the Playful and the Humorous. And it's going to borrow a lot from C.T. Nguyen and his conception of playfulness in games. And Maria Lugones, a philosopher who writes a lot about play, and some of the philosophers of humor, like John Morell and Robert Roberts, the rather redundant name, who look at humor as a kind of virtue. And so those are some of the things that I'm working on now.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. quite an exciting time with lots of work to be shared and to be published. So before we close today's episode, we would just like to say thank you once again for joining us. It's been a really refreshing episode on humor, and a new take. And I personally learned so much more about Frederick Douglass. I had no idea who he was until today. So, this is very, really educational for me. And if our audience would like to find out more about your work and follow you, where should they go?
That's a good question. I'm not on anything other than, I guess it's called academia.edu, which I guess you can find me there, just Chris Kramer. There's just papers and such there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you for sharing, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Lou. I appreciate it. It was fun.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.